Hi, my name is Peter, and I'm a parishioner at Mary, Queen of the Apostles Parish in Salem, Massachusetts. This is my weekly personal reflection on the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. In Sunday's Gospel, we hear about a scribe who asked Jesus, "What is the greatest commandment?" And if you just skim the reading or just pay minimal attention to it, it sounds kind of like this. Jesus says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And then the scribe says to Jesus, "You're right." Now, if that's all we hear, then I think we missed some important details in context and an important point. Sunday's reading tells us that the scribe approached Jesus because he saw how Jesus responded to other Jewish religious leaders. Those leaders were challenging Jesus, and Jesus more or less put them in their place. Now, the scribes were experts in the Jewish law, and I've read that there are some 613 different laws in the Old Testament with which the scribes would be intimately familiar. They would teach others how to apply these laws in all sorts of situations in their daily lives. Now, why would someone with that kind of knowledge and experience want to approach Jesus after watching Jesus correct other leaders? So I don't think he wanted to challenge Jesus. Instead, I suspect this scribe was genuinely struggling with the details of all these laws. He was down in the weeds, as they say, and needed someone to help him understand the big picture. I think he wanted and needed a wise teacher, someone who could give him a good answer to a question he had been struggling with. And I initially found it odd that the scribe said, "Well said," in response to Jesus' answer. The first time I read this, the scribe sounded patronizing. It was kind of like the scribe was praising Jesus for answering the question correctly, like a teacher praising a student that answered a question well. But now I don't think that's the case. I think the scribe said, "Well said," in the same way you or I would when someone explains something and we finally get it. So what is it that the scribe finally understood? Well, notice the scribe didn't actually repeat what Jesus said. He instead said this: "To love God and neighbor is worth more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." Jesus said nothing about burnt offerings or sacrifices or their worth. But the scribe would have known about the laws requiring them. It seems to me like the scribe really put two and two together. Because the law to love God and neighbor is greater than the laws requiring sacrifices, then to love God and neighbor is worth more than any sacrifice. And this would explain why Jesus then noticed the scribe had answered with understanding. But then why did Jesus tell the scribe, "You are not far from the kingdom of God"? Well, what struck me was the similarity between what the scribe said and an important passage in the book of the prophet Hosea. Quoting the prophet Hosea, Jesus twice rebuked some Jewish religious leaders, telling them they needed to understand the meaning of the words, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Mercy is a selfless love of others, and thus the love of God too. When we are merciful, we bring about and participate in the kingdom of God. In contrast, when we focus on our compliance with rules, like the ritual sacrifices and burnt offerings, we're not focusing on mercy, but on ourselves. So when we understand that God desires mercy, not sacrifice, we are not far from the kingdom of God. Well, you might wonder now, how does all this relate to the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist? Especially since the Catholic Church also teaches that the Eucharist is a sacrifice. Well, I think the ritual observance of going to Mass and receiving the Eucharist, if considered primarily as a rule to be followed, or a behavior that entitles us to heaven, that really puts us in the same category as the Jews who focused on the ritual observance of burnt offerings and sacrifices required by their 613 laws. Just going to Mass without loving God and loving neighbor, it becomes about us, our sacrifice, what we do, and not about loving others, the mercy that God desires. But when we realize that the Eucharist is someone, Jesus, and not just something, and that receiving Him in the Eucharist strengthens us and feeds us so we can be an instrument of His mercy, then we can focus on bringing Jesus with us into the world to help us love everyone we encounter. So when you worship at Mass this Sunday, whether in person or virtually, whether receiving communion or not, or performing a spiritual communion, ask Jesus, whom you receive in the Eucharist, to help you understand the greatest commandment, and that going out with Him to love God and neighbor as His instrument of mercy is worth more than the ritual observance of rules. You won't be far from the kingdom of God. May God bless you, and see you next week.